Hello, welcome. Good to have you here. If this is your first time, my name is Jose, and if you're returning, then great. It's great to have you back. Um, so today, I want to enlighten you a little bit on what is depression, right? And what is the relationship between depression and childhood trauma, okay? So first, let me tell you a little bit about my life, right? I was severely abused by my mother, okay? She was also severely abused in her own childhood, okay? And when I was born, she was also the victim of domestic violence, right? In the hands of my father, all right, who was a an alcoholic, right? So I'm giving you the picture, right? My mother was neglectful as well. I suffered malnutrition, right, when I was a baby, and my belly got inflated, right, because that's a sign of malnutrition. All right. Um, So my mother, right, was severely abusive to me, right? And she was pretty abusive to my older brother, right? He was 1 year older than me, right? And what I can remember, right, is she was angry all the time, right? She was constantly cursing at us, constantly hitting us, right? Uh, Smacking us across the face, right? I remember always, most of the time, I had a swollen lip. I remember that as part of my childhood. And I remember an angry woman, right? So very angry all the time and explosive, right? Uh, Now, when she wasn't smacking me around, smacking us around, or cursing at us all the time, or wishing us bad things to happen to us, uh, she was whipping me with the belt, right? This is the more severe, if you will. Uh, she will be whipping me with a belt for wetting the bed, right? And this happened every time I wet the bed, so which was regularly. And her way of dealing with that was to, whip me with the belt, right? Um, and there was another instance where I was outside, right, playing with a friend, and that friend he grabbed a frog, right? This was in Puerto Rico, right? There are frogs in Puerto Rico, big uh bullfrogs, I think they're called. They're big, and he grabbed one and threw it, right? Um, he called my name out. I looked, and he threw it, right? And as soon as I saw him do that, I just started running. I left. I didn't. I never told him to do it. I never encouraged him. So I go home, right? I run home, and mm, you know, it just so happens that somebody knocks on the door. This is all I remember. Okay, I found out after the fact, right? What really happened. But somebody knocked on the door, talked to my mother. She grabbed me, took me to the shower, and started pounding my face in. Okay, blood was gushing out of my nose, my mouth. I remember looking down and just blood just gushing down, right? And this did not phase her, right? This did not phase her whatsoever. She just kept on doing it. Uh, and this was for something I did not do. Okay, I didn't do this, right? So so that is I give you a small view, right, if you will, right, uh, of my childhood, right, how my mother was, right. Now, with my father, he was emotionally distant. He was an alcoholic, right, who beat my mother. Then my mother made him stop, right. She told him to choose between the family and the alcohol. And he chose the family, right? But he was never emotionally available or really available in any warm way, right? He was very distant, very, cold, uh, not very affectionate was in any way. So now I give you a picture, right, of my childhood, right? Uh, for the purposes of, there's more. There was more abuse outside the home, right? There was sexual abuse outside the home because when a child is abused at home, that child is vulnerable, right? Is vulnerable to being abused outside the home too. Okay, because that child is looking for love, right? It doesn't have any at home. It's looking for love and belonging. So that makes the child uh, very vulnerable, right, to predators outside the home. Okay, and that happened to me. Uh, so that's a brief, right? That's a brief overview of my abusive childhood, right? Now, my mother, right? She was diagnosed with depression, right? Severe depression, right? And I remember her telling, I remember hearing from her that she was diagnosed at an early age, right, with severe depression. I mean, I'm sorry, major depression, right? Depression, right? We could call it depression. Uh, and when she came to the United States, right, when we came to the United States from Puerto Rico in 1982, right, uh, she was automatically uh, deemed disabled, right, due to her severe depression, her major depression. Okay, and she was deemed that she couldn't work, right? She was given SSI. The doctor saw how severe it was. It was, her major depression. So how how could this how what is the relationship between her depression and the child abuse that I suffered and my brother suffered? And you know why did she thought, oh, I left one thing out and I'm sorry, that she thought while I was a baby that she thought I was possessed by an evil spirit. Okay, she thought that my father's mother, she thought she was a witch, right? And she thought my father's mother was sending her evil spirits to the house. And one spirit, according to her, one spirit got into me, possessed me, and that gave her the the excuse, right, to be more severe in the abuse toward me, right? Toward me. Okay. Uh, so let's look at this and try to understand, right? Come up with some understanding, right? Um, so depression. My mother had it, right? Depression. Let's first of all let's talk about depression a little bit, right? Depression is common, right? It affects about 6.7% of the U.S. population. That's about 22 million people in any given year, right? And it does not discriminate. Okay, depression affects anyone, right? The well off as well as those that don't have much money or or you know a career. They may not have a career. It doesn't matter. Depression could affect anyone, right? Uh, those that don't haven't seen much success in their life and those that have seen success in their life. Okay, so it can affect anyone. All right, now when my mother had me she was 19, right? When she had my brother she was 18, right? So another thing about depression, right, is that the symptoms are very often manifest themselves, right, in adolescence or young adulthood, right? Uh, in adults in their 20s, 30s. So my mother was 19. So she was around that time where the first symptoms occur, right, of depression. Okay. And just for you to know, right, that depression, right, is linked to some very serious illnesses, right? Like heart disease, diabetes, cancer. even thyroid disease, and even Parkinson's disease. All right, the researchers have discovered that link. Okay, so my mother, in her later years, right, she did have problems with her heart, right. I remember her telling me that she had a heart doctor. The heart doctor was giving her medication for her heart, so her heart was not as healthy, right, as it could have been. All right. So now depression has many symptoms, right? I'm going to leave a link so you can see all the symptoms of depression, right? But today, for the sake of the discussion, right, we're tying depression to child abuse, right? So one of the symptoms of depression is irritability, right, and restlessness, right? Like I mentioned earlier, my mother was always very angry, very irritated all the time. Okay. And my father too. Okay. My father too, even though my father was not that aggressive physically, but he was distant, cold, right? Kind of like always in a bad mood, but like simmering underneath, right? He didn't have the outburst that my mother had. But he could have likely been depressed too. Okay. But uh, and he did emotionally neglect us, right? Which is a form of child abuse, emotional neglect. Yes. Uh, okay. So irritability or restlessness, right? And I'm gonna leave you a whole list of all, like there's other symptoms, as you probably already know. Feeling sad, right? Uh, prolonged periods of sadness, guilt, hopelessness, worthlessness, okay, low energy, right? Thoughts of suicide, difficulty concentrating. Okay, so I will leave you a link so you can look at all the symptoms of depression. So today we're going to look at irritability and restlessness, right? Because that is what is connected to childhood trauma. Okay, now what can trigger the symptoms of depression, right? I think you might know this already. Stress, right? Stress can trigger, right, the symptoms of depression, right? So all the stress my mother was going through, right, triggered, right, her own childhood trauma, uh, my father beating her, right, all that, and we're going to talk about other triggers as well. But those two are very, very stressful, right? And that trigger her symptoms of depression. Okay. Now for teens, right? And my mother was a teen; she was 19, right? Again, I will leave you a link so you can look at all the stressors in adolescence, right? Like academic pressures, peer pressure, bullying, right? Uh, but the one we're going to look about today, we're going to at today is trauma or abuse, right? Because I'm trying to show you from my own life, right? So my mother was being abused, right, by my father, and she got abused by her father, right? So that is trauma. So that trauma was triggering my mother's depressive symptoms. Okay. Now for adults, right? Because she continued to abuse throughout my whole childhood, right? So first she was a teenager, then she became a young adult, and then an adult, and she was continuing to abuse, right? So again, for adults, uh, the ones we're going to look at today, the symptoms are becoming a parent, right? She became a parent, right? She was 19, she was an adult. She was a teenager and an adult, right? She was an adult. Becoming a parent, right, could be a stressful situation that can trigger depression. Okay, and again, trauma or abuse, the same thing. So for a teenager, trauma or abuse. For an adult, trauma or abuse. So that was definitely present in my mother's life, right? A lot of trauma, a lot of abuse. So that definitely was a enough stress, right? Enough ongoing stress to trigger, right? To trigger those symptoms, right, of abuse, of depression. Okay, so uh, women and depression, right? Let's look at that, right? Women and depression. Okay, now depression disproportionately affects women. Okay, uh, maternal depression, right? Is a public health emergency. All right, it's a serious thing that is going on in our society, right? It's a very dire situation. Okay, 20% of women, right, experience one lifetime episode of depression, right? Okay, 20%. Okay, and 2/3 of those are mothers. Okay, 2/3 of those are mothers. All right. So that's a big number. That's a lot, right? It disproportionately affects women. All right. And what about the children, right? The children of depressed mothers, right? Well, a child, right, with a depressed mother is at risk, right, for developing their own psychiatric disorders. All right, they're at risk for that just by the mere fact that they have a depressed mother. Right now, they have a 2 to 5 fold, right, for developing both internalizing and externalizing disorders. All right, 2 to 5 fold, right? The risk for children of depressed mothers to develop internalizing and externalizing disorders. Okay? So, what is an internalizing disorder? Internalizing disorders are, like the word suggests, internal, right? Like depression, anxiety. And what is an externalizing disorder? Well, like the word says, external, right? ADHD, right? Oppositional defiance disorder, right? For example. Okay? So, the children of depressed mothers are, you know, at high risk, definitely. Okay, and depression, right, is a common complication of pregnancy, right? It affects 1 in 7 women. Okay, so my mother had all the a lot of risks, right? A lot of risks, right? She had the trauma for her own childhood that she was dealing with. She had uh, my father beating on her, right? She was a parent already because she had my brother, my older brother. She was pregnant with me, right? And then she became a parent again, right? So, and then while she was pregnant, right, the complications, and she did share with me that her pregnancy with me was very tough for her, right? It was very tough. It was, you know, she said that it was very, very, very complicated pregnancy. That she, I don't. It was just, it was not an easy pregnancy. That's what she told me. So obviously, that would be definitely a trigger, right, for depression. So it looks like, and then one other thing, right? My mother, right? We were low income, right? My mom, she is we're Puerto Ricans, right? So we're considered people of color, right? So the for much high the risk for developing depression is much higher for low income women of color. Okay, 30 to 50%, right? 30 to 50%, right? Is much higher for low income women of color, right? 30 to 50%, right? And studies, right? They have shown that depression has a long-term effect on the social, behavioral, well-being of young children. Okay, so research has shown that the depression has that long-term effect on the well-being, on the social behavioral well-being of children. Okay, so this is actually, research has shown this. Okay, it has been shown with research. Okay, so remember I told you that my mother was abused, right, as a child. Well, uh, in in the majority of cases, right, in the overwhelming majority of cases, right, of significant adult depression, there is some form of abuse that happened in childhood, right? Either physical, sexual, emotional, or a combination, right? So my mother was definitely abused physically, right? And emotionally, right? Yes. Okay. And like I said before, right? If there's physical abuse at home, if there's abuse at home, the child becomes vulnerable to sexual abuse, right? Because they feel alone. And when they feel alone, like I did, uh, they're vulnerable to predators, and the predators, they can tell when a child is alone and they don't have the parent support. When they don't have the support, a predator can see that, and the child is vulnerable. Okay, so in almost every case, right, in almost all cases of adult depression, there is some abuse that happened in childhood. Okay. All right. So what happens, right? Why is this so? Why is child abuse, makes us susceptible to depression? Well, as you can imagine, right? When there is trauma in childhood, right? The fight or flight response, right, is on overdrive, right? Is on overdrive, right? All the time. That's what I remember in my childhood, right? I don't remember moments of, very rarely, right? Moments of calmness. No, it was constant, constant, constant. So what that does to the fight or flight response, right? That response is there for us to spot danger, right? To spot threats and either run or fight, right? To protect ourselves, all right? And so when this is overstimulated in childhood, right, it becomes very, very sensitive, okay? Very, very sensitive. It's just like if you take your hand and you keep smacking it, right, for a long, long time, the skin is going to become sensitive, right? uh Something similar, happens in the brain, right? It's constantly activated. uh it becomes very sensitive, right? And what happens is that we, survivors of abuse, we become sensitized to even small amounts of stress, right? uh Something like, oh, I have to go to the store and I have to be back before dinner. I gotta make dinner for my child, and time is running out. Just that alone could be very stressful to a survivor of child abuse, right? Because our stress response is very sensitive, right? So, even even small amounts of stress, right, can can trigger, right, the release of stress hormones, right? And all these stress hormones, right, like cortisol, just just go everywhere around the brain, right? Affecting all different areas of the brain, right? Overstimulating all areas of the brain, right? And then what happens, this is what creates, right? This is what results in, right, the symptoms of depression, right? When the brain is constantly on overdrive, constantly, constantly working, constantly being stimulated, constantly, right? The results are a vegetative state, right? You're just so tired, right? You got problems sleeping, right? Sleep disturbances, cognitive dullness, right? You're not able to think very well. You're not able to think straight. You're not getting new ideas. You can't be creative. You cannot be very creative, right? Because your brain is so stressed out, right? And the loss of pleasure, right? So vegetative state, sleep disturbance, cognitive dullness, and the loss of pleasure, right? This is the result of an over excited, fight or flight response, right? It results in depression, right? It results in the symptoms of depression. And also, there's also anxiety, right? It's also anxiety. Uh, and that seems like, it seems obvious, right? It seems like it makes sense that you're going to be anxious if, if you're always, scared. If you're always scared, something's going to happen. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense that you're going to be anxious as well. Okay, so remember, depression and abuse are multi-generational, right? They run in families from one generation to another. If nothing is done about it, they continue to uh, appear in their next generation. All right, they get passed down. All right, so depression and abuse, right? They go hand in hand. Constantly on high alert, right? Looking out for danger, looking out, never relaxing. This produces that vegetative state, the cognitive dullness, right? The loss of pleasure, right? And the problem sleeping, okay? It's this constantly that we cannot relax, right? We have a very hard time relaxing, all right? Okay, very good. So remember I told you that my mother thought that I was possessed, right? By a malign spirit, an evil spirit. Well, psychosis, you may think of psychosis, right? As a symptom, right? Of schizophrenia or schizoaffective disorder. But psychosis is also a symptom, right, of mood disorders like bipolar illness and depression, right? Psychosis is also a symptom of depression, right? So when my mother was on, and also like depression, right? Like depression, psychosis is also, tied to stress, right? It's also tied to stress. How if there's a lot of stress, and my mother was under a lot of stress, right? As I already pointed to you, right? She was abused herself. She was dealing with her own trauma from abuse. My father was beating on her. Uh, and all these stressors, right? All these stresses. My father was not paying the rent. She had to move out she got kicked out. My father was drinking instead of helping pay the rent. So that's a lot of stress, right? So, you know, uh, psychosis is also stress induced. It's also stress induced, okay? So my mother was going through all that stress, and it seemed natural, right? That she will start thinking that I was possessed, right, by an evil spirit, considering all the stress she was going through, right, and the lack of support. Now, she told me that my father actually was the one that told her when I was a baby, right, that I was making weird faces and he thought that I might be possessed. And it looked like he was actually the one that gave her the idea and then she just ran with it, right? Well, it turns out that psychosis, right, is not only a symptom of depression, it could be a symptom of substance use, right? Like alcohol. And my father was a very heavy drinker. I mean, so much so that, he, as far back as I could remember, he had rotten teeth. All his teeth were like rotten, right? He only had like a few left uh, when I started noticing. And that shows what a heavy drinker he was, right? He wasn't paying the rent. He was drinking his money, all his money. My mother's getting kicked out. So it's not far-fetched to think that he also developed some type of psychosis, right? And they both develop some type of psychosis. Okay? So remember that so like depression, right? The symptoms, right? Psychotic episodes, right? Typically, right, occur in adolescent or early childhood. I'm sorry, adolescence or early adulthood, right? And my mother was 19, 20, right? Adulthood, right? Early adulthood. And it is equally prevalent, right, in both men and women. So they both both have a similar chance of developing psychosis, and it looks like my father and my mother, they both developed it. Okay. My mother due to her depression, and my father due to his heavy drinking, right? And maybe some depression too. Uh, Now again, it follows a stress vulnerability model, right? That means that if you're vulnerable to stress, you're likely to develop psychosis, right? And my mother was already abused, right? She was being beaten by my dad, so she already was in a vulnerable place, right? She was already vulnerable to stress because there was so much of it already in her life. Okay, all right, very good. And another thing about, right, we lived in Puerto Rico at that time, right, and kind of the culture, right, around my mother, like she always talked about witchcraft all the time, right, about witchcraft. My father's mother, she used to call her a witch. She said that witch sent an evil spirit to this house, and that was constant, right? uh so that shows that that is the culture that she was, the type of people she was surrounded with, right? And psychosis is it depends, right? It depends the type of psychosis you have, the type of psychotic episode is going to depend on your life experience and where you live, right? For example, right, people who live in the West, right, in the United States, right, uh, their psychosis usually, right, have to do with being a celebrity, right? They think they are a celebrity. Okay? People on the East Coast, right? They think they're an FBI, right? Or government agent. And in people in the South, right? They think they're a religious leader, right? So my mother was surrounded by that, right? She constantly talked about witchcraft, right? So yes, her psychosis is going to be around witchcraft, right? So what this says, right, is that psychosis is not random, right? It's not random. It's just, when it comes to depression, right, it's not random, right? It's specific to your life experience, right, and where you live, right? So there has been, right, some research done that has found, right, that some people who have major depressive disorders, right, also experience psychosis, right? Also in the form of paranoia. Okay? So that makes sense, right? My mother was going through so much stress, and she was very scared, right, of, due to her psychosis, all these beliefs about, evil spirits and things like that. So of course, right, it sounds like it makes a lot of sense, right, that there will be some paranoia associated, right, with that psychosis. All right. Okay, very good. So how does that relate to childhood trauma? Okay, well, there was a study done, right, on mothers, right, who were receiving home visits, right? And I will leave the link so you could take a look at the study, right? And the study showed, right, that there was an association between maternal depression and child abuse. Okay. Um, Now, for mothers, right? Those mothers that have clinical depression, right? Who have clinical symptoms, right? Uh, the Child Protective Services reports, right? And maternal depression increased. This is consistent, right? This is consistent with a growing, right, amount of research revealing that children of depressed parents are at risk for experiencing insensitive, neglectful, and hostile caregiving. All right. So a growing body of research is showing that children of depressed parents, right, are at risk for experiencing insensitive, neglectful, and hostile care taking. All right. So my own life supports these studies right here, right? Because my mother was depressed. Uh, Her chances of developing depression were right. They were um, what it did. All this stress, right, increased her chance of developing depression, which increased her chance of developing psychosis, which increased her chance of abusing me, right, and abusing my brother. Okay. Now, the severe abuse, right, that I suffered, right, uh, was also due to her psychosis, right? Her psychosis, right? There was also triggered by all the stress that she was living with. Okay, so now I have a better understanding of, you know, the the psychological reasons, right, why I was abused, right? So I hope you found this video helpful. If you have ever, if you suffer from depression and you're a mother, please be aware of this. And if you're a father, please be aware of this, right? That you have a greater risk, right? You have a greater risk of uh, having problems, struggling with parenting, right? You could have a greater risk if you have depression. So, you know, make sure you get help. Make sure that you look for that help to help you, uh, you know, regulate the symptoms. If you were abused as a child, right, and you're a parent, you know, please go ahead and get screened for depression, okay? Because it's very likely that you have it. So then it doesn't have to affect your children, right? And you could have a more enjoyable experience, right? Being a mother and a father, okay? All right. So now you know the risk factors and how they could affect our children, right? And how trauma uh, trauma makes us vulnerable to depression, right? And depression makes us vulnerable, right, to have problems parenting our children, right? So it's like a cycle. It's a vicious cycle. um, all right, so if you found this video, if you found this topic important, please give it a like. All right, please leave a comment and tell us what's your experience, right? Were you abused as a child? Uh, did it? Are you depressed now? And how are you handling it? What are you doing to get better? Are you a parent that was abused as a child? How does that affect you? How is that affecting you as a parent, right? Uh, Remember, there's help out there you could get. You have support. There's support out there to help you. Okay. And so if you like videos like this, if you like to see any more videos like this, go ahead and give it a like. I'm sorry, go ahead and subscribe. And that lets me know that you're interested in seeing more videos like this. All right. Okay, good. So it was great having you here. And You have yourself a wonderful day. Have a wonderful day. Take care. Bye bye.